Hi, my name is Renee Piazza, and this is Lindsey Wettle. We're two dietitians at City of Hope at the Chicago Center. And so today we're here to break down nutrition facts labels and understand what the marketing lingo means. And that's on our food packaging. We'll talk about how to build healthy meals and provide some tips for meal prepping and cheaper alternatives along the way. So without further ado, we'll get into it. So first, before we talk about healthy eating, we got to define health. So take a moment. I know we're not in a whole group together, but what does health mean to you? If you need to, take a moment. You can pause this video. Okay, and then now that you've thought about what health means, how do you distinguish between what's healthy and unhealthy? So the definition of health is a general condition of body or mind in reference to soundness and vigor. So health can actually be or changed in different ways over time depending on where our status is. So health could be a poor health or good health, and what we need for our different health statuses can change as our bodies and minds change overall too. So with that in mind, some of the information we'll talk about today might be in terms of good health, or in you're experiencing some sort of side effect during treatment. We might also reference it in terms of that type of health and what can we do to manage the side effect at that time. In general, we'll be talking about just healthy habits for the average person who is not going through a lot of side effects from treatments and things like that. But if you do have specific questions about those and we don't discuss it today, feel free to reach out to the dietitian at your local City of Hope and kind of get more detailed answers from them. So then we're kind of getting into a nutrition facts label. So there's a lot of different components, but I'll kind of point out 5 of them that are in reference to things that we think are important for you to be aware of, and then also in reference to things later on in this presentation. So the first part we always like to bring up is talking about serving sizes. The reason being is that serving sizes can be different for each person, but if you are looking at information that's on the food label, it's all in reference to that particular serving size. So for example, if you're looking at your label on the left, if you end up having about a cup of something, then all of the calories and the fats and the sodium and everything on that label will be higher than what it says on the label. So that's just something to be cognizant of, not necessarily limiting you. And in some cases, it might be better to have more or less than that amount. The calories is kind of listed there, but I think that's kind of, based on a 2,000 calorie diet, but some people need more and some people need less. Then kind of going on to the fat section. So, and sodium, I kind of want to pair those together. In general, the standard American diet tends to have more saturated fats and sodium than are needed. And so we recommend, if you are looking at kind of food labels and you are trying to kind of, and you're not really kind of going through any sort of condition that hinders you from having these, that you might need more of these type of items, we would say maybe try to focus on reducing how much of the saturated fats and trans fats and sodium that you're consuming. This is also important for good heart health as well. Then I'll kind of go down to the sugar section. We get lots of questions about sugars with this idea that sugar feeds cancer. We'll go on a little tangent there. So a lot of times we get that question, and that's because this idea, I guess the idea behind this the sugar feeding cancer phenomenon is that excessive amounts of our added sugars, so things that we find in a lot of our desserts and processed goods, can increase risk for all the comorbidities we learned about during COVID. So our obesity, diabetes, hypertension, things like that. And then excessive amounts of, or a couple of those kind of conditions can then increase risk for cancer and cancer reoccurrence. So there's a relationship there, but not quite as direct as a lot of people or the media makes it out to be. So do you need to go on a keto diet? I don't recommend that. But we can also talk about that on an individual basis if that's something that a patient is passionate about. So when I'm looking at this food label, it talks about added sugars, and those what I was talking about at first. The added sugars are the things that we want to kind of reduce the amount of in our diet, because those can be hidden in a lot of processed foods in particular. And then lastly, I kind of talk about the ingredients list. The ingredients list lists foods or the components of that particular food item in terms of how much by weight of that particular item there is. So in this food label on the right, you'll see that cultured grade A non-fat milk is the #1 ingredient. Well, it's yogurt, so that kind of makes sense. As you go down the label, there's less and less of those particular items. I will point out too, at the very bottom of that label, it mentions stevia leaf extract. Stevia leaf extract is naturally produced from the stevia leaf, and it's a sweetener. It's a kind of a sugar alternative. So if people are looking to reduce the amount of sugars they're eating, but kind of still have something that tastes a little sweet, you'll find these in there. That being said, it's not typically added on the food label underneath the sugar section because it doesn't have the same makeup as sugar would. Sometimes some food labels have sugar alcohol sections on them, but this leaf extract wouldn't even relate to that. So I will say not everything in the description of the ingredients does fit on the area above, but if you have more questions, again, talk to your dietitian. All right, then now that we've kind of gone over a little bit of the food label, I'm going to pass it on over to Lindsey.
All right, so now the next part of it, we talked with Renee a lot about, okay, the individual ingredients of something, but now what do we do when we're trying to form an entire meal? Because yes, we can individually assess all these different types of food. And sometimes, yeah, it can be mostly a meal made into one, but how do we build it all together? So my first question really for all of you is, how many of you have seen this My Plate before? It's the visual that's on the screen. Take a moment and be like, are we familiar with it? Maybe we're more familiar with the My Pyramid. So the food pyramid where it had like different vertical colors of different types of foods. There was a guy that was running up the side of the pyramid, or even if you remember from once upon a time, more like the 90s, there was a food pyramid where it was just blocks, horizontal blocks of different food groups that was built up on each other. So a lot of different variations of something that's trying to convey the same thing is, how do we break up, how do we form a meal in terms of the proportion of food that we have over the course of a day. So here they have dairy. This could also be dairy alternatives. Renee and I always get a lot of questions of like, okay, I'm lactose intolerant. I can't have regular milk. Is almond milk okay? And yes, that kind of goes into our dairy alternatives. There are a few little tweaks that we always throw out there, but we'll talk about those in a bit once we get to that dairy section. Our protein shakes that Renee and I, and probably your local dietitian, depending on which location you're going to, usually promote, especially if we're going through treatment. Protein shakes, they fall into that dairy category as well. For grains, we'll talk about, okay, they say make half your grains whole. Well, what the heck does a whole grain mean? And how do you find what is a whole grain? And is that even good for you? Depending on the type of side effect that you might be experiencing from your treatment. Now, if you have diabetes, we still want you to incorporate some kind of grain into your day-to-day meals. You want to have probably more higher fiber options, and so that's where then our whole grains come into play. And again, we'll dive more into this later. For protein, it's our favorite topic we always love to talk about. I always joke with my patients, it sounds like we're trying to make you into a bodybuilder with how much protein that we're constantly on you about. But really, it has a lot of benefits during treatment to help rebuild your body's cell counts as we knock them down with treatment. But it also helps you maintain your muscle mass and maintain your weight through treatment too. And we want to vary our protein sources with both plant and animal sources. And Renee, she'll talk a little bit about protein in a bit in terms of ways that we can make it a little bit more appetizing even. And then finally, our fruits and veggies. Yes, we save this for last, the best for last, but also you notice that it takes up about half of our plate if we're really feeling good. We want these to be the most of what we're able to eat, including our protein. Don't forget that. But we'll also explain how we can make these fruits and veggies where having them fresh, frozen, or canned can still be healthy, depending on kind of economically where we're at this point in time, because we know that that can change quite a bit and it's different person to person. Something that we want to talk about is also the new American plate. You'll notice that a lot of people will say, oh, you have cancer, have a plant-based diet. And a lot of times that's not very clear. We think, oh, they want me to be a vegetarian. Notice how we didn't say vegetarian, we said protein with both plant and animal. So we do want a little bit of animal sources in there. So these are two examples on the screen of both kind of this my plate all in one kind of one pot meal, or a casserole. If you're from the Midwest, casseroles are big. But then on the other side, on the right side of our screen here, we notice that there's actually more divided in terms of what's on the plate. So you can see the broccoli, the tomatoes, that's quinoa that's on the plate. Think of it as like a round rice. So instead of like a long like line, it's more of a circle shape, but similar to rice. And then we've got some other veggies there. So the meat option there, it looks like it's going to be some kind of turkey or chicken, poultry item. Now, both of these plates, variety of colors. And so you get a variety of different nutrients that come from all of these different colors. And you'll notice that most of the plate is coming from some kind of plant. Between our rice or our quinoa, our veggies that are on the plate, like the broccoli, the peppers, the carrots, talking about both plates here. But then we also have a little bit of that animal protein. So not too much where it's taking up half of our plate. It's still going to be majority of our plate coming from some kind of plant. And when we say plant-based, that's what we mean. Most of our plate is coming from a plant. Alrighty, so now I'm going to pass it back over to Renee, and she'll talk us through at least the beginnings of some basic preparation things for foods, but then also some frugality here, that how can we get the biggest bang for our buck when we go to the grocery store?
Yeah, so now we've figured out, okay, how do we figure out foods based on their food label, and then how to put meals together with all of these different components. And so now kind of, yeah, as Lindsey said, kind of talk a little bit about each of them in more detail. All right, so first we'll kind of talk about our fruits and vegetables. So as Lindsey had mentioned before, we're okay with a variety, having fresh, canned, or frozen. I know sometimes canned gets a bad rap, but believe me, it's okay. Sometimes, especially if you're going through treatment, maybe you don't have somebody to be there for you at every meal to cook for you and things like that. You're feeling more fatigued than normal. Well, if you're more fatigued than normal, it can be hard to cook too. So sometimes having these canned or frozen options are a great way because they're already prepared for you. All you have to do is warm it up, sometimes even as easily as in the microwave. And so with canned vegetables, or even some of the fruits, we recommend maybe rinsing them off beforehand. The reason being is there's a lot of extra sodium, as I mentioned before, that can be hidden on the vegetables, and added sugars that can be in the canned fruits. So by rinsing them off before serving, you can get rid of a lot of that excess. When looking for the canned products, but you can also look for ones that are low sodium or no sodium added, or the canned veggie or fruits that are made in 100% fruit juice, which has the no added sugar, and a light syrup, which has less than a heavy syrup would have. From the other end of things is our frozen veggies and fruits. So again, kind of looking at that food label, making sure there's nothing kind of hidden in them. Sometimes I've noticed some of the frozen fruits are more prone to having excessive sugars, but there's plenty of brands out there that don't have the added sugars in them because fruits are already sweet. So of course you can buy all these different varieties, and hopefully this gives you more flexibility with yourself as you're going through different treatments, so you can still incorporate a lot of these different things. Another way to buy more frugally is to buy things that are in season. So in the link below, you'll see be a printout for a little handout that we had created. And so it has a list of the seasonal fruits and vegetables. So by buying foods that are in season, you can also get a better deal. Plus, the fruits and vegetables will be more delicious because they're picked closer to ripeness. And so that can be another benefit as well. So buying in season and finding dishes that kind of use those seasonal flavors can be another way to buy more affordably too. So here I kind of just have it listed. So if you have difficulties printing that off, you can always screenshot these pages, and it kind of talks a little bit more about what's in season during different seasons.
All right, so I'm going to steal back a little bit, and we're going to talk about the grains, because I know that, like I said, we want to make half our grains whole grains. Now, this is really if we're feeling really well. Let's say we're experiencing a lot of diarrhea or we're really nauseous. Maybe whole grains isn't the best option for us at that point in time. I talk a lot about with patients wanting to pivot kind of how we eat. We're not changing completely how we're eating. It's just temporarily, as we're experiencing these really bad side effects, how do we help lessen that burden? How do we give you back some good quality of life? And so that's when you come and visit either Renee and myself, if you're in the Chicago clinic, or one of our other really good qualified dietitians at any of the other locations. And we really can talk about, okay, how do we address your side effects at that point in time? If we're feeling well, we want to make half our grains whole. There's a few different ways that we can look at what a whole grain is. So we're going to do a little bit of an anatomy lesson on grains. You can see on the picture at the bottom of the screen, it says grain anatomy. There's 3 parts to a grain: the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. And in order for a grain to be a whole grain, you need all 3 components. So oatmeal, wheat, barley, rice, brown rice, those are just some examples of the different types of grain. So there is more than one type of grain out there. So if something, I'm going to go over to the secret to decoding whole grain labels picture here. If something says 100% whole grains, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're only using wheat. We could be using different types of grains. Now, how do we know if something has whole grain in it? Usually it's labeled that way. So 100% whole grains, that means that it has 100% of the grains used are whole. So they might have other ingredients in there. For instance, if it's bread, there might be other ingredients to make the bread. It's not just going to be the grain, but all the grains used are going to be whole grains. Now, let's say that something is labeled whole grain or whole wheat. That doesn't mean that they're 100% whole grains. It's not 100% unless it specifically says so. So whole grain or whole wheat, that means a little over 50% of those grains used to make that product are whole grains. But that doesn't mean that refined grains aren't also included in that other, 49% or whatever percentage that is. If it says made with whole grains, that means that there's not actually that many whole grains in there percentage wise. So this is based on the percentage of whole grains used. That is how different companies or products can use what particular label. So majority of that grain, if it's made with whole grains, could be actually refined grains. So if you're trying to make your half your grains whole, try looking for something that has 100% whole grain, or maybe it's 100% whole wheat or whole wheat flour, or whole wheat bread, sorry, that would give you a better idea of making half your grains whole. Now, there's a few other sources on here I want to kind of refer to really quick. They'll sometimes say high fiber or an excellent source of fiber. This doesn't necessarily contribute to our grain content, if it's a whole grain or not. It just says that this has at least this much fiber in this product. So per serving. As Renee was talking about with the nutrition label, we want to look first to see, okay, what does that serving size say at the top of that label? And then as we're going down the label, we can see fiber, and usually it'll then say if it's a high fiber or excellent source of fiber food, about at least 5 grams of fiber is in one serving. So if it's bread, usually one serving is one slice of bread. So it'll have at least 5 grams of fiber in that one slice of bread. Now, I know I'm kind of skimming through a few of the other ones, and you can look at the slide closer to see, okay, what do these different things mean? But I'm going to jump down to multigrain, because this sounds like it should be really healthy. Multigrain, it's got multiple grains in it. So this might be something that I want. It's kind of a vague term, though. It's like if we label something as natural. What does that mean? In this case, multigrain means that there's just multiple grains that were used to make this bread. If it says 100% whole multigrain, then great. We know that these have, it's 100% made out of different whole grains. But multigrains, that means it could be made with oatmeal, wheat, barley, brown rice, flax seeds. I mean, different types of grains that are out there. And including refined grains as well. So it sounds healthy, it sounds really good for us, but really it's kind of a vague term. And so that's when we have to go back and we have to look at, okay, what does our ingredients label say? As Renee started off with, why we started with the nutrition facts label. So we're going to go through and test your knowledge a little bit here. We have 3 different food labels, the ingredients of them, to kind of help determine, okay, is this, 100% whole grain? Is this just made with whole grains? Is it multi-grain? Different types there. So first things first, when we're looking at an ingredients label, remembering what Renee said at the beginning of the presentation, this is based on weight in terms of how much is in the food product. In this case, do we know that these are bread ingredients? So for this first one here, using my mouse, we have whole wheat flour is listed first. Great. So alrighty, have that in the back of our heads. Whole wheat flour was used. We also see that they have some bulgur wheat and whole wheat again. So what do we think that this one is? Take a moment and think. Is this going to be 100% whole grains, made with whole grains, 100% whole wheat? Is this going to be a multi-grain, wheat bread? What do you think? Alrighty, if you said 100% whole wheat, you were right on the nose. Maybe you just said it was made with whole grains, or if it was whole wheat bread. I know that those are similar, and it's hard to kind of tell sometimes by just the ingredients label. The second one, we're looking at unbleached, enriched wheat flour. And a really quick thing about enriched, a lot of people hear that and we get a lot of questions of, okay, is this going to actually be good for me? Enrichment means that they've put back in vitamins and minerals that were originally part of the grain, but during that process of getting the grain from the fields all the way to the store, we cut out some of those good vitamins and minerals that we're looking at that we want. And so they're putting them back in to give us that same nourishment there. So it's unbleached, enriched wheat flour. And then you see there's a whole bunch of what was it enriched with. Whole wheat flour, wheat gluten, wheat bran, and then 2% or less than whatever. What do you guys think that this is? If you said some kind of wheat, you were pretty dang close. This was honey wheat, which honey was listed as part of the ingredients. We just kind of skimmed over that. So, okay, for our last one, we have whole wheat flour, wheat gluten, brown and golden flaxseed, oats, yeast, bulgur wheat, brown rice, sunflower seeds. We've got a whole lot of things in here. Cornmeal, there's a lot. So what do we think that this bread would be labeled as? if you said some kind of multi-grain bread, you were on the nose with that as well. So multi-grain, notice how there's a lot of different types of grains that were used in there. In this case, it was whole wheat flour that they used. But remember, just because it says multi-grain doesn't mean that it's necessarily a healthy bread source as well. It might not be whole grain still. It could have refined grains in there where we don't even think twice about it because we see multi-grain and we think good. Alrighty, I'm going to wrap myself up for now, and I'm going to pass it back over to Renee to talk to you guys about protein sources.
Alrighty, so we talked about fruits and vegetables with their great antioxidant property and how they're really good for our immune system. Got to our grains, great energy source, and also great source of fiber, which is really good for bowel movements and things like that. But now we're on to proteins. As we said before, we are big fans of protein. So when it comes to protein, there's meat is kind of one of the main sources that comes to mind. And sometimes, meat can be a little pricey. We've been to the grocery store, and sometimes a pound of meat can be a little bit more than a pound of veggies. Yeah. But there are ways to make it a little bit more affordable and make it taste appealing to you as well. So one way we could do that is by doing marinades with bulk buying meats like chicken or even sometimes salmon or other types of fish as well. So in this example here, you can see on the right, I've got a bunch of different varieties. But what we can do when marinating our own meats, because there's a lot of different marinades out there, but marinating your own meat can actually be a lot cheaper. And it's also pretty easy. The possibilities are really endless. So what you can do is you can buy some fresh or frozen meat that's either on sale at your store, or if you buy it in bulk, it tends to be a little less per pound. And so then you can divide it into containers or Ziploc bags if that's a little bit easier. Then it's less cleanup. So if you're fatigued, you don't want less cleanup, then Ziploc bags could be the easier way to go. But then you portion out the meat into whatever portion you think is appropriate for you. So if you are cooking for a family and you know that your family will not eat leftovers for any reason at all, and you probably won't eat them either, then just portion out exactly how much meat you think your family would eat. Or if you like to make food all at once, then have it for another 4 days, then portion out however much meat that would be. So you can put it in these plastic bags or whatever containers that you have. And then that's when we start being creative. So you can create your own marinade by using these 4 components. Typically, there's an acid, which helps with tenderizing the meat, makes it nice and soft. Then also adding some sort of fat or oil. This kind of keeps it nice and juicy and in that regard. Also helpful for when you're cooking it too, because you already have the fat on the meat. And then adding some sort of salt and seasoning. Sometimes the salt can be incorporated in the seasoning, like if you're doing a teriyaki mix, then you get some soy sauce in there, which naturally is higher in sodium anyway. But the salt also enhances the flavors of the seasoning. So that's why we say at least put a little pinch in there, wouldn't hurt. So then you can add these varieties. So I have a list of a bunch of them on the right there, but then also again, looking back at this packet we talked about earlier, I have a list of a couple different ones that are provided on the Eating Well website. If you didn't know already, Eating Well is a website that has a bunch of recipes that are made by dietitians like Lindsey and I. So there's a plethora of them on there. I tried choosing quite a variety, so hopefully one of them at least appeals to your taste. So those are kind of on there for your reference, but feel free to be creative or use whatever's in season or whatever you have in your house. So those are kind of some marinating tips. I will say once you have them all organized in their little baggies, you can just stick them back in the freezer and then take them out the day before you think you're going to use it. And then by the time that it's defrosted, then it has already marinated long enough and your meat's ready to go. In terms of fish, sometimes fish doesn't need to be marinated as long just because it's thinner. So those you can do the same day, or I mean, you could freeze it. You'd probably just want a quick defrost instead of defrosting all day, or else it might be a little more tender than you anticipate. So that's a little bit on the meats, but then kind of getting to beans and legumes. These can be sometimes the most underrated. Well, I guess they're considered a vegetable too, but they're a great source of protein and they're really cheap and affordable. if you haven't already, cooking dry beans from scratch at home can be a super affordable option because if you ever go to the grocery store, seeing a pound or two of beans can only be, up to $1 to $3, depending on where you go and what type of bean it is. And that can make anywhere between 10 or 12 or even more cans of beans. And cans of beans are pretty affordable too, with only 99 cents a can. Well, at least in this time. We'll see a couple of years down the road, but at least for right now, beans can be pretty affordable and chock full of protein. So a couple of things if you haven't soaked beans before, one thing that you can do is if you know that you're cooking beans, in the evening or late that day, sometimes 6 to 8 hours before that meal, that's when you can put an inch or two of water in a pot above where the line of how many beans you're using are. So, so then you can put that in the fridge, just let it kind of pre-soak. This pre-soaking method isn't needed, but it can help reduce some of the gassiness that you experience when you have beans. And it can also help the cook time, because sometimes cooking beans completely from dry does take a lot longer. So you can cook beans then on the stove top, and that can take 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the type of bean. Or if you have a pressure cooker, for example, that can be done in little as 15 minutes if they're already pre-soaked. So things like that are just to keep in the back of your mind is always a great option to incorporate some beans, because we like to have a variety of plant and animal sources of protein. And then now that we have these beans, well, what do we do with them? So there's a variety of things. You can add them to your soups and chilies, to tacos or enchiladas. My favorite's like a deconstructed enchilada, where you kind of put it all in one dish and just kind of mix all the stuff up, because rolling things ends up being a mess for me, at least. There's bean salads where you can add a mix to them, which is kind of our picture in this bottom right here. And even like bean dips or hummus, where if you have a blender or some sort of food processor, you can just mix them all in together and then add some seasonings. So there's lots of different ways. These are just a couple that we listed here. And so feel free to be creative and look online for other ideas as well.
Yeah.
All right. So now that we've been through almost everything, we're just down to the wire with dairy.
Yeah, and so talk about another good protein source. Dairy is definitely falling into that category as well. It would be considered more so an animal source if we're going with regular cow dairy milk. If you're looking at one of the dairy alternatives, then that would be more of a plant protein source. But that protein source can vary depending on the type of dairy alternative milk that you are consuming, etc. So you remember the got milk signs? Well, we got dairy. So you can always, economically wise, if you like yogurt or cottage cheese, purchase a larger container, and you can then kind of scoop out your desired portion, especially if you don't have much of an appetite. Then maybe it's something sometimes easier to just take a little bit at a time. It's less intimidating to look at all that food and go, okay, I can definitely have, a few bites of this food, few spoonfuls, versus an entire container. Even if you get like one of the individual yogurt containers, can still seem daunting. So purchase a larger container and spoon it out to more individualized servings. If you're not trying to gain weight, if you want to talk more weight management with us, that's when we opt for kind of lower dairy fat options, where then there's less saturated fat and as well as less calories. Now, a lot of times we get questions on, well, what's the difference between whole milk and skim milk in terms of like that cow dairy milk perspective? Whole milk and skim milk, the biggest difference is going to be the fat content, which then leads to the calorie content. Protein wise, it's going to be fairly similar, maybe a gram or two off between whole milk and skim milk. But for the most part, it's really the calories that we're looking at. Now, if you're anything like my parents, when they got married, my father grew up with whole milk, my mother grew up with skim milk. We had to compromise, and now they are still happily married, drinking 2%. So sometimes you're not trying to, cause waves in the kitchen or in the home with your significant other. Maybe it's a 2% household like mine was growing up. Well, that's still good. It's still going to be a little bit less calories than whole milk, a little bit less saturated fat than whole milk, but it's still going to provide a similar amount of protein as whole milk as well as skim milk. All right, so for our lactose intolerant individuals, and I know that there's quite a few out there, especially in my family too. So what about dairy alternatives? Well, non-dairy alternatives, think like your almond milk, soy milk, oat milk. I mean, there's so many different types of milk out there. They'll naturally be lower in saturated fat and calories comparatively to regular milk. Skim milk might be closer of a comparison between the two. But as a warning, our oat milk, our almond milk, and our coconut milk all have lower amounts of protein in them. I know that there's so many more different types of milk out there than the ones that we reference on this slide. And so that's when we have to go back to, like Renee was telling us at the very beginning, to that food label and looking to see, okay, what's the serving size, which for most milk is going to be about 8 ounces or 1 cup. So for 8 ounces of milk, how many grams of protein is in that? And that's where we want you to look and kind of evaluate and assess. For regular cow's milk as well as soy milk, it's going to be about 8-9 grams of protein. For other types of milk, oat milk, almond milk, those tend to be lower, more like 1 to 2 grams of protein, really depending on the brand, even 2, how much milk you drink. So does that mean that almond milk or oat milk or coconut milk, are they bad? No, they're not bad. It's just that they have a different level of protein in them. And so if you're going to use dairy as a protein source, just know that they're not going to provide a lot of protein. They were going to have to work a little bit harder to get that back up. But that's when we go back to what Renee was talking about with our beans, or, I mean, we have nuts, peanut butter, if you like peanut butter or almond butter. We've got all the different types of meat, and Renee talked about marinades. So really a lot of different choices that we can have when it comes to protein options.
Oh, before we move on, I wanted to add something real quick. A lot of our patients do ask about, well, I can't have Boost or Ensure because I'm lactose intolerant. I do want to add that the Boost and Ensure products, if your dietitian asks you, and this isn't the same for every protein product out there, I would say talk to your dietitian about that particular product. But if you are lactose intolerant, those products don't contain lactose. Lactose is actually the sugar that's found naturally in milk. And the Ensure and Boost products take the protein part of the milk instead of without the sugar part. So for that reason, all of the Ensure and Boost products are lactose free. So don't be concerned if they recommend you one of those and you don't really tolerate dairy very well, because those products are accessible for individuals in that regard.
Yeah, and if it's something where you're curious about, okay, do I like the taste of it even? A lot of times we do have these products, either Boost or Ensure, down in our cafeterias. And so when you are on site, you can pick up one to try it. But a lot of times too, you can ask and see, do we have any coupons? We work really closely with our representatives from like Boost and Ensure. And so sometimes we do have coupons that we can share with our patients. And so don't be afraid to ask. The worst that we will say is, no, I'm sorry, not at this time. So good input there, Renee.
Alrighty.
All right. Well, if you have questions and you are curious, you want to talk more about what we talked about in the presentation, or maybe you're just really struggling with a lot of different side effects. Maybe you just are curious because you've had a bombardment of information from family members, friends, the internet, everywhere in between. That's why we have dietitians on staff here, is to really help and assist you in that journey. And so we're here to help answer those questions individually, because a lot of times our journeys are, individualized in terms of our reactions to different chemos. But that's also why cancer fighters are here, so that you can have a community of other individuals and their caregivers, whether you are a patient yourself or you're a caregiver listening to this for a patient. There are people out there to help support you and help walk with you on this journey. We're just one part of the deal, one part of the coin here. So please use your resources. We're here to help you, whatever that looks like. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you for stopping by. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to your care team and they can help in getting you scheduled with one of us. So have a good rest of your day and hopefully we'll see you soon.